Introduce our speaker today, Dr. Reanna Phillips. She recently completed her PhD in archaeology at the University of Chester, focusing on the process and performance of burials in Roman Britain. She mainly focused on the grave context of major cemeteries in Roman Britain, identifying previously overlooked evidence of varied mortuary and mourner participation in the extended burial processes. She completed her master's in the archaeology of death and memory, which is a really cool master's. I did not know that was a thing. At the University of Chester in 2017. And again, focusing on social memory and performance of decapitation burials. She has over 6 years of experience teaching in universities in the UK and China, covering a wide variety of topics. But tonight we'll be looking at some burial practices in Roman Britain. Fair warning, there will be images of human remains very briefly. Shouldn't be too much of an issue, hopefully. If it is, I'm sorry. And over to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. So this is Funerary Performances, identifying the process of burial in Roman Britain, based on continuing research from my doctorate moving forward. Oh, thank you. Okay, so today I'll be talking about, again, my continuing doctoral research stemming from the previous studies of burials in Roman Britain that neglected funerary approaches that explore the experiences and participation of the living. I'll be looking at the effects of funerary rites on social remembrance and social relationships throughout burial using a contextual approach, identifying further variations and similarities in practices across the stages of burial. I'll be interpreting this evidence of participation throughout this process of burial and use case studies from urban cemeteries in Roman Britain. All right, so in Roman Britain, you have increasing urbanization, eventual intermingling of people from all over the empire. Burial studies are divided a bit in the evidence between urban and rural locations, as well as other divides. Burials are generally outside community boundaries. This is thought to have to do with a potential fear of the dead, which is being challenged, as well as a pollution of the dead. You've got an overall trend towards inhumation in the later period, and lots of burial data, as well as improving techniques that reconstruct the process of burial. Increasing awareness of variation in these practices, which had been previously thought of as deviant from the norm, has increased calls for reframing our approaches to burial. So we've thought burials in Roman Britain have been fairly uniform. Again, this is changing. In general, with inhumations, you see a supine west-east orientation, often coffined, but not always. Cremations have an urn, but there are some in situ pyrocyte cremations. There's a non-majority with grave goods, but a wide variation: ceramics, vessels, shoes, dress objects, etc. There's not very strong correlations with age, gender, demographics, and there are difficulties in earlier data sets as far as dating and sex identification and whatnot. And it's very notable that there's a lack of burials in comparison to the expected population. So we do have selection in burial rites. So in this abundance of burial data, as well as non-burial material evidence, including literary evidence from the continent, there's been a potential reduced reliance on mortuary theory in comparison to fields such as early medieval prehistoric burial studies. Many burial artifacts are used in wide-scale typological studies without their burial context. And specialist reports among all this data can divide and obscure individual grave data. So these large bodies of data often focus on finding out what's going on with these big trends, but it can and does encourage decontextualized understandings of burial practices and features. So I'm asking, why was this burial feature chosen in this situation? But it's very hard to do in reports when they don't include burial data across individual burials. So there's a need for contextualizing this burial process, the choices made at each stage, the evidence of participation throughout burial. So generally, the field is focused on the identities of the deceased in life. There's been less exploration of the idealized portrayal of the deceased through burial, and very little focus on funerals as mediums of social expression and change among living participants, their own identities, their worldviews, when studying burials in Roman Britain. So we know burials are not only to deal with the corpse, but also to commemorate the social being. And using theoretical approaches from many different fields, my approach particularly was fueled by looking at agency and materiality of bodies, the emotion of participants, the social memory that these practices can create among them, looking at people's experiences in landscapes, as well as the theatrical spectacle and performance of rituals, and their embodied and sensorial experiences when participating throughout burials. So focusing on understanding the experience, motives, and effects of dealing with the dead. Funerals were an emotive time of gathering and remembrance. Burials were an opportunity to remember, create, negotiate identities, portraying through the funeral and use of material culture. So these rituals were selected and enacted, and participation was visible among communities. The objects, actions, and the individuals are involved all make up the commemoration, these memories taken forward and then adapted in later burials, remembered and continued. So these funerals can create a palimpsest of memories. So who are the participants? Again, they are very likely close family relations, friends, associates, prominent members of communities, political, religious roles, hired laborers, specialized funerary technicians. We could have paid mourners, performers like clowns and mimes and whatnot, undertakers that deal with other aspects of burial, and wider members of communities. So burial evidence shows the public nature of stages of burials, as well as aspects of the private rituals. So aside from disposal of the corpse, we've got social, religious obligations, laws, norms, localized familial traditions, and social competition as participation is being seen, among others, throughout the stages of burial, being seen actively contributing to or orchestrating funerals. It's portraying these idealized identities of the dead, negotiating the identities, relationships, and ontologies among the living, and creating memorialization through participation in these potent performances. So again, funerary mediums and mechanisms of expression and negotiation among the living. So my approach, again, nothing completely new, but understanding the participation rather than what's being done passively in burials, but the role of the participants throughout the early stages of preparing for the funeral, procession or transport to the burial site, graveside displays, again, both cremation, inhumation, the transformation of the body, as well as later practices, finishing the burial, maybe memorial rituals that continue on, integrating the memory and creating that palimpsest moving forward. So preparing, again, gathering, preparing the body, washing, adorning with dress objects, shoes, private viewing is likely took place in the home, and these can be private rituals that can be seen later on in the burial. This can also include the construction or preparation of aspects of the burial, like the pyre, the cutting the grave, building the grave structures, preparing the containment. Procession would be transporting the body and all of these necessary elements to the gravesite through, again, since all the burials are outside the boundary lines, there's likely memorial pathways remembered, repeated over time. This stage has been expanded, in my understanding, to include not only that, but conveying cremains from pyre site to their secondary grave sites. So we've got multiple opportunities. It's not quite as simple as that nice lateral flow chart, but I've omitted a far more complicated web that I created. It's a bit too feral. So remains could also be conveyed elsewhere for liminal curation and subsequent rites. But all of these changes in location demonstrate an opportunity for visible transportation and further performances. Again, gathering of mourners, performances, and transporting the body container, feasting supplies, etc. So at the burial tableau or pyre graveside, we've got further gatherings possible, arrangement of the body or cremains, and further interaction, including display of all the elements used in the burial stages from here. More opportunities for speeches, drama, feasting, libations, and that deposition of unworn objects, such as shoes, hobnails, and many other objects that we find in the grave that wouldn't have been adorned earlier. So this is further opportunities for visible interaction and manipulations of the living with the dead. You've also got concealing and revealing the remains throughout. So a corporeal transformation. This not only includes the cremation of the dead, but the slow and sequential covering of the inhumed deceased, as well as infill of the grave. So again, very performative spectacle, burning of the body, or laborious infill of graves. This not only physically, but can contribute to the mnemonic transformation of the deceased. We've got more deposition of materials, as objects aren't only found within coffins, but outside in the infill, and same goes for cremations, both in pyre site locations as well as secondary burials. So infill, incineration of the pyre, more opportunities for graveside, pyreside performances, as a cremation could take upwards of 12 hours of expert and difficult labor. I also include the cooling of the pyre, the raking of coals, pouring of wine to cool. This would take manipulations and sorting of cremains if they were to be buried elsewhere after. The collection of perhaps burnt hobnails and dress objects, and further rites of interaction and transformation. Placement of stones, lids, continued sequential construction of burials, including surface depositions at the end. And integration, the most amorphous stage, but it can include memorial practices like further visitation, later burials that would remember the locations of their burials of their family members, friends, close community relations as they re-entered areas to conduct further rituals. It could also include curation, reuse of remains, re-entry of burials, reuse of objects that didn't end up being placed in the grave, but perhaps taken and used later. And then grave markers and tombs that show, again, the potential for further remembrance and visitation. So not only using a large-scale analysis in my approach, but also combining with investigations of specific burial processes to really understand the effects of these practices. So this is how we contextualize the process and the choices made in the evidence of participation throughout the burials. So I've increased focus on these participation, used the theoretical approaches to frame not only the data collection, presentation, analysis, and interpretation to better understand these experiences, motives, and effects of burial among the living. And when approached in this framework, we find many aspects of discrete burial types, such as inhumation and cremation, that are shared, as well as further variations in burial types than we've seen before. So my data set was based on 2,600 burials, analyzed again together from 4 major urban cemetery sites. I selected these for quantity, quality of data, reassess prominent sites, and contribute a new process, a new approach to burials. So I built a big data set, big analysis that both contributed wide-scale approaches, wide-scale analyses, while preserving that contextual data for each grave in this manner. And then I did many comparisons, many queries to compare different aspects of burials and further investigate shared and disparate elements. So use of, for instance, containment in cremation burials ended up being much more complicated than is there an urn or isn't there. And we find secondary cremation containment, as well as cremations that were uncontained but buried with vessels. So we find much more variation than initially thought. So I further investigated, in particular, 3 selected burial practices in detail and used specific burials to investigate. So looking at body containment, I found that this was not considered required, as slightly over half of burials were uncontained across both inhumations and cremations, but that the use of burial containers indicated key moments of revealing and concealing the dead. They facilitate focal moments of interaction through touch, sight, and other senses at different stages throughout burial. And that containment or concealing and revealing could be achieved through other means, perhaps less detectable shrouds, coverings, grave constructions, and they can demonstrate a clear focus on, in particular, graveside display and performance, also demonstrating widespread planning, labor, community involvement in different instances. So looking at this grave from Cirencester of a young child, the presence of metal coffin fittings indicated the likelihood of planned moments, multiple moments of concealing and revealing, as most coffins were found without evidence of hinges, but that perhaps there were still yet moments of repeated concealing and revealing. Yes, and it's very important because this particular grave found no evidence of structural nails, which are often the only indicator aside from perhaps soil stains or imprints. Most often structural nails are there to indicate the outside or shape of a coffin. This one was found without any. So it disturbingly indicates that perhaps body containers, coffins, didn't always use detectable metal forms to fasten. So there are other yet to be detected methods of covering, concealing, containing bodies here. So this inhumation from York, featuring an elaborate stone kist built around throughout in an extended process. So starting with the laying of these foundational stones and the deposition of this ceramic below, the body was then placed into a coffin, placed into this cut, and then layers of stones were built up around it. So not only the collecting, the quarrying of this stone, transportation, and then communal labor and planning, the resources involved to create this, shows that communal participation throughout the stages of this burial. You can think of it as physically transforming the corpse through this concealment over time and investing that labor and integrating the participation in this process of the people that were there. So interweaving a wider community participation into the memory of this burial, as well as this monumental physical reminder that would be there after. So in this cremation from Eastern London, the cremains were placed in a ceramic urn with a lid that was over 110 years older than the urn. Again, there's a range, but it was at least 110 years older than the urn, which would have been at least 90 years old at the time of its burial. So potentially we have a curation of body containers. So this is the only data set I found that showed that potential, perhaps reuse or creation of containers that were then later used. It was a wider practice suggested at Eastern London. The container was also heat affected and wasn't thought to be used as a cooking pot. It was thought to be perhaps storage or buried before that, again, and then reused later. So it potentially had a role near the pyre. That wasn't a very common practice, but there were other containers that were found to be heat affected as well. Again, showing the potential role of objects used later, containers used later in those earlier stages. There's also secondary containment as the urn was placed into a tile kist with fragmented lid, suggesting further participation opportunities for individuals to engage in this burial. At Cirencester, this adult male, the cremains were found in an inverted, unlidded urn. Much of the remains had been spilled out, So it was thought at the time that this must have been an accident, or perhaps an uncaring, you know, casual burial, a quick deposition. But again, as this practice is rare, it did find at least one other example in the data set, and there are other examples of perhaps intentional inversion. Again, prone burials. I forgot to mention that with the with the child burial with the necklace. So I'm going to go back because that was a really no. I'm so sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's coming. So there are further rites of inversion, which are very interesting that I'll get to. So rather, instead of being a casual accident, it was more likely something intentional. So of all the cremations that are found without an urn, this could allude to them being poured out intentionally in a moment of interaction visibly into the grave cut, showing the role of containers like the curated lid or container from the previous burial, perhaps in that second procession from the collection and pyre site, objects like cremation urns were used and then later used again for different burials within families or associates and whatnot. So yes, and along with the generally sporadic use of lids for cremations, again, not found most commonly, but when they were used, they were often not something made specifically for the urn, but like a plate, or in the previous one, like a tile lid. So it further highlights that containers were not always meant to be like an airtight seal, but perhaps symbolized or provided opportunities for further interaction, concealing the dead, further transforming in that process from beginning to end in the burial. So again, showing again the use of containers and the visible participation in funerals, and that performative element of pouring out cremains into other cremation graves as a performance. So the other selected practice was looking at worn and unworn dress objects. So we find lots of variation in the choice to adorn the deceased with dress objects or to place them separately unworn in the grave. There were no strong correlations with types of objects, people, demographics found. It seemed to be, again, a choice made at the time in each case. And so wider research, both of Roman sources and beyond, does indicate that potential expression or construction of identities using dress objects, often thinking that wearing dress objects portrays your identity. But my research also showed that this provided differential opportunities for participation, either in earlier stages of burial, private moments of adornment in that earliest preparation stage. Perhaps that was when it was natural to adorn the body with worn objects, and then later deposition at the graveside into the pyre tableau when you find burnt dress objects. They can be worn or placed separately as well. So this could show differential opportunities for participation. Again, this could show that these are different people participating, perhaps the family adorned, and then later wider community members could participate later visibly, or family could choose to show what they wanted to convey through that adornment, or maybe more visibly portray later by the deposition. So it shows that selected moments, choosing either private, public display, again, or both. Often you see worn and unworn objects in the same grave. So the necklace I was talking about. This child, around 3 years of undetermined sex, was deposited prone in this inhumation burial, arms crossed at chest, no body container. Again, previously it's been thought that maybe prone burials could be a sign of disrespect. Lack of body containers could be a sign of disrespect. I think all these variations and contextual understandings in these graves show that these are more complex in understanding. This was not a disrespectful burial of this child. This wasn't intentional. It wasn't an accident like some people suggest prone burials can be, because there's no body container. They wouldn't have accidentally buried the body prone on its stomach. It was specifically chosen. So it had 2 bone bracelets worn, one at each wrist, and a very, very long necklace of 150 glass beads that would have been around to the waist of the child when worn. So I interpret that this was likely not worn in life, as the original report thought this 3-year-old child was running around every day with a necklace reaching his waist. I think that is probably not practical, but rather chosen to express for reasons during the burial by the living. So this could be perhaps they're showing the beads and their far locations. Maybe they were collected and made on a string to show widespread connections. It could be wealth. It could be a necklace that had been worn or used in the family before, and then putting it in that burial visibly could have conveyed that later when associated with this child. So it more shows these choices made by the living rather than conveying the identity of the child when it was in life. So this notable adornment would amplify that memorial effect, that memory of this burial in this rare display throughout these earlier stages of burial into then the careful placement of the body in the grave when the necklace perhaps wouldn't be as visible after as it was prone. So this inhumation of a possibly female subadult in a coffin buried with 21 dress objects. So only one was worn, a hairpin in the hair, and 17 bracelets, 2 rings, and 1 string of beads were placed piled together near the head in this burial. And so it was thought this, eclectic mix of objects, some of the materials from elsewhere, some from local. They thought this could be an exotic person who traveled far. These were all their bracelets they wore in life, but rather the isotopic analysis showed that this person was local. And the size discrepancy of the bracelets was also thought to potentially indicate that these were different sizes for bracelets worn close on the wrist versus armlets. But it's also very likely that these objects maybe weren't worn by the deceased. Maybe they weren't worn all by one person. Maybe they weren't owned all by one person. So again, this could show these differential opportunities to show participation in adorned hairpin, perhaps placed by people during that preparatory stage, and then this deliberate separate deposition of all these objects later. So these depositions, these separate depositions of these objects could rather emphasize the living altogether and not mean to portray the identity of the deceased. It could be a sequential one-by-one approach to the grave, maybe coordinated, separate people placing objects visibly, and then everyone would remember that's one person who put a bracelet in the grave and then associate it with them rather than with the identity of the deceased. But it could have also been placed all by one person, one high roller that had a huge, huge deposition, and then you would really remember that one person's participation in all the objects and aspects associated with them. So it further emphasizes that active collaborative nature of the burial tableau in this one moment in the burial. So in this cremation from Eastern London, we've got an urned secondary vessel, so cremation vessel, as well as a tile as a lid, and 3 unburnt bone hairpins placed within the urn among the cremains. So again, we see the extended preparation, burning of the body at the pyre, all that performance, later collection, placement within the urn, procession to the secondary burial site, and then these unburnt objects, showing that this stage was also a moment for performance and participation, a moment to further interact with the burial and placement. Perhaps these hairpins were worn in the hair of the deceased prior to the burial and then taken out, placed later. Perhaps they were worn by people attending and placed later, or perhaps just carried and transported to this moment and placed separately. But it does show that multiple stages of participation and the differential uses of dress objects throughout. Yes, so dress objects could be worn earlier, used in the procession prior to the pyreside rites, worn by mourners, and yeah. So the last selected practice I looked at was hobnail shoes, which is a fairly common grave good found in less than 15% of burials. But my research showed that they were not always included in pairs. So sometimes you find single shoes as well as a few instances of 3 shoes. You find, again, there are perhaps more outliers that are likely obscured by taphonomic decay or recording. They were not always worn at the feet of the deceased. There's a wide variation in location. So they're most often found near the feet or worn, but many placed separately near the feet, near the head, near the body, or in different places, not together. So wider research of shoes, really interesting research that's been done, but rare studies have shown potential ritual purposes of shoes. So we see them in watery depositions elsewhere. They could convey identity, symbolism, iconography, as well as the roles in that non-burial deposition. They were relatively disposable, so you would use your shoes until they wore out in less than a year and get new ones. So that could show why they were such a common grave good, in that they're available and they mean something to everyone. So they could have personal and also portable, changeable meanings when used in burials. As well as the research showed that hobnails could hold meanings in separate interactions, as it's often assumed that burnt hobnails found in cremation burials were perhaps scooped up on accident with the collection of burials. But you see other interesting activities, manipulation of hobnails that could show that they carry the meanings of shoes beyond. So the interactions with hobnails could also facilitate the same purposes as deposition of the shoes. So this inhumation at Lank Hills shows wood stain as well as a stepped grave cut, shows a timber-built chamber platform, stepped structure leading into the inhumation cut. So the coffined burial featured 2 shoes placed outside the coffin. So this is another element where the study of body containers as well as hobnail shoes combine, because many items, as well as, shall we say, people, babies, were placed outside coffins, on top of coffins, around, not only showing that extended process after the covering and concealing of the body in coffins, but further rituals took place. So a coin was found under the skull of this individual, again, showing not only that interaction, graveside interaction within the coffin, but then the covering and then further deposition of the shoes outside the coffin. So again, showing planned labor and integration of people participating throughout, the intent to emphasize the visibility of the participation, the performance of deposition, and this further interaction between the living and that grave, that extensive, elaborately constructed grave cut. So again, those are rare, but there's enough found where planned, visible grave cuts are quite common. So this could also show a type of ephemeral monumentality through grave construction. So not always surface level monuments created, but perhaps the extremely laborious and memorable extended process of doing some of these burials would create, shall we say, a monument in your memory, something that lasted in this remembrance over time of burials. So this pyrocyte cremation demonstrates the sorting of burnt material. So the pyre was built at this site. The burial, the burning, incineration, cooling was conducted, and then instead of gathering and transporting elsewhere, the burial was then infilled inside. So this context showed specifically and deliberately one pile was made of the cremated material, one other pile was made of the hobnails, and then further piles of objects that included a potential knife blade and coin were presumed to have been there but were intercut by later graves. So again, after the cooling of the pyre, we've got further visible and communal labor, perhaps in that further interaction and manipulation done prior to the infill of that burial. So a second pyrocyte cremation shows something, again, not too rare, but a burial, a pyrocyte cremation burial where the individual was left in situ, or manipulation and sorting and collection was not done, but the person was cremated and then the cremains were found in an anatomically laid out order. In addition to burnt glass, bird and cattle bones, further illustrating all of these elements involved in the cremation earlier, the hobnails that were found and likely burnt in the pyre were found in an area that did not correlate with the feet. So again, showing perhaps a separate deposition atop the pyre. The presence of structural nails likely indicated a use of a pyre coffin, which was found to be quite common in the data set. So again, the cremating of bodies could be a quite visceral and perhaps dangerously explosive process, but also, again, that mnemonic effect of covering the body, concealing, containing prior to incineration. And then there could be further opportunities for placement of objects atop those pyre coffins, potentially including these hobnail shoes. So not only, again, were the cremains found anatomically arranged and undisturbed, but later rituals in this process included, after the infill, a surface deposition of one unburnt, defleshed horse skull. And there were no evidence of butchery marks or tool marks, so it's uncertain how the flesh was removed from this horse, but it was specifically selected and chosen and placed at the surface after infill of this in-site pyrocyte cremation. And then 2 unburnt ceramic vessels were placed inverted over the horse, one over the nose of the horse. And this was oriented roughly in the head area of the cremains, potentially intended over where the head of that person had been in their memory previously. So again, we have selected participation in this burial and showing rituals that were significant over time. In the data sets, potential fill depositions, so the infill or burying of an inhumation or pyrocyte cremation, generally considered, if objects are found in there, generally considered accidental. But it's cases like this where you're thinking perhaps the coins found in fills or at the top, objects like this show that perhaps the infill wasn't just a matter of course, but opportunities for further participation, performance, and rituals such as this one. So overall, a contextual approach to burial highlights complexities of participation across the stages of burial that has been previously overlooked. It shows that large-scale trends do need to be contextualized or understood in the context of individual burials and vice versa. We need theoretical approaches to explore the motives, meanings, and effects, experiences of the living, why they chose this, what the effects would have done when enacted. And in doing so, this further understands, interprets the process that these choices made and each stage and participation throughout. So we've seen many available rites during the course of each burial used to transform the dead. So many of these were found concurrently at sites, enacted at roughly the same time period. It shows the use of material culture and moments of interaction and participation potentially utilized as technologies of remembrance or memorable performances that could be continued or adapted, remembered among family members and communities. It shows that differential opportunities for participation throughout the burial process. Perhaps, again, people had access to the private preparatory stage or access to that visible participation later, or choices made by specific family members to either adorn or place separately, to either perhaps portray the deceased or to emphasize their own identities or their own participation. So yes, rites were chosen not only to idealize the identities of the deceased, but also the living, and display connections both to the dead in active participation and potentially each other, as memories of who participated, who was there at each time, at each stage, would be carried forth, and again, for further rituals. It further challenges this old idea of the fear of the dead in they don't seem to be too afraid of participating actively in many different moments throughout burials. So perhaps this emphasized public participation shows rather, integrating your own memories of the living with the dead was more the goal. And the concept of ephemeral monumentality, or memorializing the dead through performances that were memorable, and intertwining that practitioner with the deceased and the others present. So further studies can explore participation in stages of Roman burial across the empire. And analyzing the burial process, we can better understand social complexities of life in Roman Britain, material culture, and beyond. We should increase robust theoretical studies of participation in the process of burial, and we can use contextualized approaches to burial practice. And we must interweave these understandings in reassessment of burial evidence, variations that we find, challenging typologies, both material, burial typologies and whatnot, reassess previous reports and future excavations, as well as how they present burial data to keep contextualized data together for individual burials. So that's all.
So many moments where I was like, oh my God, oh my God.
I had to cut out so much content too, so ask me so many questions. I have so much else to say.
Well, if anybody does have any questions, now is the time to ask. Ollie?
Thanks, Ree. That was excellent. I really enjoyed it, even though it's about the Romans, which I don't typically care for, obviously. Michael, you made a really powerful argument for the kind of levels of intentionality in lots of these burials, and you were quite critical of notions of kind of accident or chance or any of those sorts of things. But I was wondering what the kind of where the place is for kind of unintended consequences and risk in your analysis of these funerary practices, because like lots of anthropological studies of funerary practices show that it's really risky moments. Things go wrong all the time, right? You mentioned like bodies exploding, and Howard Williams has written, obviously, as you all know, about like people who were actually in comas being put on funerary pyres and coming back to life, and then people have to like bash them on the head because they're supposed to be dead. There's like, what happens if the body explodes? What do you do then? What happens if you drop the coffin when you're moving it? What happens if your, Uncle Jimmy loses his shit because he's mourning so powerfully, and you have to kind of funerals are these incredibly potent things, and so they're full of risk and danger. And so the way you were describing it felt kind of like people had planned these out and everything went to plan to produce these beautifully choreographed performances that were going to be memorable in lots of ways. But I was wondering about what the potential is within this for contingency, chance, emergence, and where the consequences of all of this is less kind of the outcome of a really nice, I mean, sometimes I'm sure it is a really nice staged sequence and everything goes exactly to plan.
Right.
But what happens when, shit goes wild and bodies are exploding and funerals are going crazy all the time? How does that factor into the kind of analysis that you're doing, I suppose?
I think that there definitely should be more room for a tone to allow for those, because you're right. I think in many instances, perhaps people aren't prepared for things going wrong. And if they did, what would they do? But I think perhaps the memories of what happened tend to be idealized. Maybe they would focus on the good stuff and not the, oh shit, no. Perhaps only in, moments over bevs, remembering later. But Yeah, I think the narratives built should include that uncertainty, should include perhaps a fear of the dead, but rather what are we going to do wrong, you know? So I like that. I think in a more nuanced discussion of one particular process, you'd be able to reflect that much better. So yeah, I certainly don't mean to glaze over and make everything seem so beautifully intended and carried out, but no, I think that's a very good and important aspect to reflect in burial narratives.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I was wondering about, I mean, you had some demographics that are not fully represented, and maybe even within demographics that are represented, what happens if it's a person who isn't really grieved when they're lost, or who you wouldn't think to grieve when someone like that dies, to be brutal about it.
No, that's a very real consequence, and I suspect that these would rather have been found in the missing portion of the population, is what I think is more likely, that those selected for these type of burials were the ones that perhaps had people that were invested in making memories of this person, or an opportunity to show themselves off in some way. And those that either had no people that were invested in them, or thought ill of, perhaps were left out on the wayside, although, you know, it would depend on the degree of how law dictated. So I think there's more opportunities for future study that does include exploring how people like this would have been treated if they would have been found in graves. Yeah, so for instance, in my master's study of decapitated burials, it was thought that these people were disrespected, many of them decapitated after death, but some at the time of death. But again, the context of the further elements of burial, placement of objects, containers, careful layout, and again, the potential process and labor that went in the, you know, preparation, procession, and whatnot, indicated that at least they weren't entirely intended to disrespect this individual, if at all. So it shows more complexity in the product of all these labors and that process.
Just thinking about, because it is kind of showing the different interpretations in the process throughout, but what were some of the interpretations of burials before this? Like, what were some of them saying about prone burials and things? Was it just all accident, or was it something sort of like, you know, risk, where it's like, oh, he fell in and the stone fell on top, sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I would say the one that bothers me the most, again, I shouldn't speak too ill of perhaps the dead, those that made reports that were far older than some of us are, but the interpretation that bothers me the most was a ceramic vessel that was placed specifically in this inhumation, and it had been curated and repaired, and it was interpreted as being the repair being done by an industrious housewife, and they had no way to know that, and it just made me so angry. So yeah, I think there is so much value in reassessing, you know, burial data sets and interpretations over time with new lenses and new approaches as we move forward.
We do have an online question from Anna. Did you come across any bronze or pewter vessels in the graves, or were they mainly ceramic?
Oh yeah. So metal vessels, including, you know, copper alloy, less common than ceramic, but there were plenty in different shapes and whatnot. So yeah.
And also kind of going back to the first one with the individual and the cascade with the hinges.
Yeah.
So would that have been something that they would have been opening and closing the coffin multiple times?
That's what I'm thinking. And again, this suggested. Ooh, you keep going. Ooh, you're right. I didn't think that perhaps wooden coffins could be reused, because of the over half of burials that are not contained at all. Perhaps they were transported in a container that ephemeral containers I was describing, where a container was used at some point and then not buried with it. You're right. That could be a coffin that was used or intended to be used other times. Yeah.
I'm also thinking of in some medieval cases where we have box burials where people have been very cleverly fit into a small box that was not meant for them. But it was like a everyday item or something.
Yeah.
In the house, and they were like, well, they loved it a lot.
Right.
So that's what I immediately thought of.
Yeah. This is why I think it's so valuable looking at burial approaches and burial evidence from other eras, because we can get so many more ideas too. So that's super interesting.
Any other questions from the audience? Want to say fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, guys.
You have a question over here.
Hey.
With any of the inhumation burials, and I know this is going to be limited by the data set, obviously, but was there any kind of correlation or like with observable way or like ways that people died in coffin burials or with any type of specific burial? Or was there no kind of correlation that could be observed?
So I did take note, again, I took note of all the data I possibly could and put it in that master database, but you're right, I was limited in just how many studies I could do. So I did take note of osteological data, perhaps methods or pathologies, things that contributed to their death. And I didn't find any correlations there with types of burial practices, including coffins. But I think that's very interesting if perhaps someone died of a disease and they were considered needed to be contained in some way. I think that's worth a future study as well. Thank you.
If you have any questions, you can join us at the pub at the Marquee behind it.
Mhm.
And we can continue the conversation there. But first, thank you so much for your
Oh, thank you.
amazing to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.